A rabbinic colleague recently told me that not everybody who's been calling for a ceasefire since the afternoon of October 7th is anti-Israel. Yes, most people making that demand, while Hamas terrorists were still slaughtering and kidnapping Israelis, either denied, minimized, or articulated justifications for the brutal terror attack. My colleague, though, knows and loves our people in Israel. Jewish peoplehood is central to his rabbinical service, and he feels bound to Jews everywhere. Still, he wrote to me, I started using the terminology of ceasefire almost immediately because I knew precisely what Israel was going to do, as of course they've done lesser versions of this before for lesser attacks by Hamas. My colleague, a younger rabbi, is not alone. In December, more than 1,100 young Jewish adults petitioned the Union for the Union for Reform Judaism, demanding that our movement call for an immediate ceasefire. One of those appeals cries, "We are alarmed that the leadership of our community has not demanded an end to Israel's devastating violence towards Palestinians, in addition to the safe and immediate return of hostages taken on October 7th. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs claims, since October 7, nearly 1.9 million people, about 85% of Gaza's population, have been displaced across the Strip. The vast majority of the 24,000 killed and 59,000 injured are women and children. Nowhere and no one in Gaza is safe. Those figures were provided by Palestinian authorities, presumably meaning the Gaza Health Ministry, that is, Hamas. We need not grant legitimacy to Hamas or the United Nations to acknowledge that Palestinians in Gaza are dying and suffering in great numbers. We also need not join terrorist groups, nations, and international bodies that seek Israel's destruction, who insist that the Jewish state is to blame for the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Historical precedent for civilian casualties in wartime is abundant. Writing of the February 1945 firebombing of Dresden, the National World War II Museum estimates 35,000 killed during the 37 hours of terror. Alex Wallerstein, an historian of science and nuclear weapons, undertook to estimate the deaths from the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but was unable to do better than suggesting averaging the low estimate of 110,000 killed and the high estimate of 210,000, both of which he deems credible. Both cases are analogous to Gaza today. Many of the people killed and wounded in Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki were civilians, including, of course, many women and children. We also have a compelling biblical analogy, and it happens to be in this week's portion, Parashat Bo, and is well known to anyone who has ever attended a Passover Seder. After 9 devastating plagues, Pharaoh, his heart hardened, stubbornly refuses to free the enslaved children of Israel. Killing the firstborn son of every single Egyptian, God does not claim that each of those slain boys and men is responsible for the persecution of the Israelites. Instead, God deems this plague necessary to redeem our ancestors from cruel bondage. Israel has articulated clearly 2 goals for the war: to free hostages and to eliminate Hamas's capability to harm Israelis. Those goals are not only worthy, but are the moral imperative of the state, as they would be of any nation subjected to an attack such as the one that Israel suffered on October 7th. Whether the armed conflict will or even can achieve those goals is another question. A worthy one, but one better suited for an expert in military affairs than for a rabbi. Rabbi Amelia Wolf, though, convinced me that the 10th plague does offer an opportunity for us to think about the risks and limits of military action. She notes the curious method God employs for saving Israelite firstborn sons, that they must slaughter a lamb, brushing its blood on their doorposts and lintels, so the angel of death will be able to distinguish Israelite homes from those of their Egyptian neighbors. She writes, "Maybe you wonder, as many commentators have, why such a sign is necessary. Why does the all-knowing God, who has come to redeem you and your people from slavery, who will carry you to freedom on eagle's wings, require a bloody reminder not to kill you on the very eve of rescue? Shouldn't God recognize you? Shouldn't God know your address? Shouldn't your very presence inside your own home be enough to protection from the destroyer?" Rabbi Wolf answers by citing a midrash. Once the angel of death has been let loose to strike down, it does not, or perhaps cannot, distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. Rabbi Wolf goes on to argue that violence has been unleashed in Israel and in the Palestinian territories. It is therefore bound to strike down the innocent together with the guilty, the innocent child together with the Israeli soldier, the Israeli peace activist, and the Hamas terrorist. Wolf's diagnosis is indisputable. Just as the Nazis rained death and suffering down on Europe and the world, particularly but not only on the Jews, so did they beget the violence that would kill tens of thousands when the Allies firebombed Dresden. When the Empire of Japan slaughtered innocents alongside combatants across Asia and then the Pacific, it begot the massive losses of its own people at war's end. In one way, Hamas is even more perverse. Its leaders doubtless knew that their October 7th terrorist attacks would provoke a deadly Israeli assault, the one my rabbinic colleague knew would be coming just as you and I did. Worse, Hamas likely wanted Israel to kill thousands upon thousands of Gaza civilians, winning the world's sympathy to its cause. Rabbi Wolf not only offers a diagnosis, but a rabbinic prescription. She insists that when we know the angel of death has been given permission to strike down, we must do everything in our power to brush the mezuzot, the doorposts of the world, with blood. Not the spilled blood of our enemies, but the protective blood of sacrifice. Alas, Rabbi Wolf doesn't tell us what sacrifice would fit the bill. And here, her analogy between the 10th plague and the current war fails. The slaying of the firstborn is the act that spurs Pharaoh to free the Israelites, not the sacrifice of the lambs and blood on the doorposts and the lintels. Her aspiration is noble, but nobody has yet proposed a plan by which ceasefire would lead to hostage release and security for Israelis who should be able to return safely to their homes on the Gaza border. In this unredeemed world, though, the angel of death continues to run amok as a Hamas terrorist on October 7th, striking down Israeli soldiers, Hamas terrorists, Gaza civilians, and Israeli hostages each day that the war continues. At our Seder tables, we diminish our cups of joy by 10 drops for the plagues upon Egypt. Today, our cups would be empty, drained by the deaths of Palestinian non-combatants, perhaps, except that they were never filled by the salvation of the hostages and the protection of Israeli civilians. And so we are left to pray, as our people always have, for a messianic redemption, for the day when no people shall take up the sword against another, nor shall they study war anymore. Amen.